It's been self-evident to me throughout my philosophical studies that epistemology is at the heart of all of our discussions of anything. However, it's difficult not to consider the fact that maybe ontology is co-requisite with epistemology, or co-primal, or equiprimordial, as Heidegger would say, in terms of philosophy. A lot of my interests right now regard representation. We can think of the kind of surface level thing of of representation as like having a field be more representative of different groups. That's not necessarily what I'm concerned with. What I'm concerned with is really a problem that Hegel has dealt with, that we are still struggling with epistemologically, and that Heidegger tries his best to couple with discussions of being, is how do our representations map onto things in themselves? As Kant pointed out, there is the world of material things, and Hegel proves with his master-slave dialectic that world must exist. A solipsistic, purely ideal world is impossible. But Kant says quite rightly that we only have access to this world outside of our perception through our perception, which occurs in the form of representations. And considering that, Kant said that our representations are barred from giving us real epistemic access to things in themselves, because anything must always be interpolated through a sort of code to produce a representation. So if I want to accurately visually perceive something, I have to have perfect fidelity in terms of capturing the color and the size and all this stuff about the object. But the problem is we really don't know how accurate our perceptions are of the things in comparison with the things as they are in themselves. We only have access to the way objects present themselves as representation, representation. They are presented a second time or presented again, but the problem is how exactly we would get back to that fundamental presentation before being elaborated upon and taken over by consciousness or by the perceptive instruments. This brings us to a number of challenges, because we can see this taking on an important political intersection, which is, it seems that our methods of perception give us a bit of a problem in terms of, this is an important part of rationalism, that the mind has certain constraints upon the ways it can conceive things. It can only conceive of things which are logically coherent. And not only that, but it can only conceive of them as they've been received through the senses, which the senses itself cannot be probed, because that probing necessitates the senses. And as such, we have a real problem when it comes to claiming any representation as more true than the other. It gives us a real epistemic problem with truth. And I think Hegel makes some headway with this that Heidegger really builds on. And one could question the specificity of these, but Hegel showed us that there are certain necessary ways in which perception is structured that depend on the structure of the world independent of the mind. Things like, Hegel is kind of critical of some of the laws of logic, but he also seems to utilize them. But, for example, deduction is logically valid and sure, and seems to be independent of any biases. And as such, Hegel deduces, for example, with the master-slave dialectic, that one thing we can know about the outside world is namely that there is an outside world. Descartes brings into problem with his philosophy of doubt that we can doubt everything but the fact that we exist. We must be a cogito, a thinking thing. And the process of thinking, of being actively engaged in thinking, necessitates the existence of the thinking thing, of the cogito. So the problem that Descartes realizes after that is because, Descartes recognizes the epistemic distance here. The fact that one can, because we only have access to the world through representation, we have reason to doubt these presentations because we can't necessarily know the validity of the mapping process between the things in and of themselves and that which we're exposed to through representation. And Descartes, at least I think, does a pretty shoddy job of trying to get beyond solipsism. Descartes rightly points out that I exist as a cogito, but his foundational epistemological belief that founds the existence of other things is just God, which he basically makes it a self-justifying term via his reformed ontological argument. Now, Hegel does a little bit more with this because he proves that there are some basic constituents of identity. And one of those is that identity always requires its opposite, or its negative, to be more precise. So being requires non-being in order to be a determinate property. And we experience determinate properties, so of course there must be some other. And he goes on to talk about some very basic ideas of how experience is structured, and sort of these structuring principles which not only are the foundation for representational thinking, but also serve to tell us something about the world outside of our senses that necessarily must be the case in order for us to arrive at the sort of experiences or representations we do. Heidegger is a little bit more specific than this, and he gives us, with a certainly more of an existentialist bent than Hegel, some key observations about time and about death, about social being, which really paves the way for discussions of ideology. And of course, with ideology, the question is, well, we know certain things, or we think certain things, I should say, and they are held as self-evident. and ideology is seen as the instrument by which we become convinced of those things which appear to be self-evident. And ideology can be reinforced through ideological state apparatuses, such as schools or something like this. Schools will tell us seemingly benign things about how language ought to be, or how history ought to be. And the important thing is that there is an implicit ought in here, an epistemic ought about how we ought to view things. And a lot of thinkers have shown that we really can't get outside of ideology, because in a way, well, not in a way, really, ideology is analogous to the structuring mechanisms of consciousness, of representation, that someone like Kant talks about, because Kant points out that there are certain things that are going to structure the way we experience things, and these are going to limit what we can represent. For example, we can't represent things that are logically contradictory. Now, we could get into a very confusing discussion about whether or not logically contradictory things could exist, and maybe we just couldn't represent them. But of course, implicit in the idea of existence seems to be the idea of the laws of logic being presupposed. So we kind of end up going in a circle with regards to being, and this is of course something that Heidegger points out, that there are certain preontological factors which we cannot get behind necessarily, and this may be a reason to say that Heidegger has failed in answering die Seinsfrage, the question of being. Now, this kind of maps on to ideology, because we always have things structuring our representations that we can't get out from behind. And people like Zizek, for example, deriving this, of course, from Lacan, points out that maybe the mask, or kind of the ideological apparatus by which we are shielded from the things in and of themselves, maybe the mask might tell us more truth than what's behind the mask, because of Lacan. Of course, Lacan is very critical of the idea that there is something behind these masks, and that, in fact, the methods of representation need not be done away with in order to tell us something about being and about epistemology. And as such, we recognize that we can't really get away from structural epistemological mechanisms. Things like the laws of logic could be said to put limitations on what we are able to experience, but they are preontological constituents. They're not things that can just be done away with. And as such, this gives us maybe a bit of epistemic issue when it comes to representation, because it intersects with some questions about knowledge that may lead us to think that knowledge is not exactly as sure as we like to think. That knowledge is in fact in der Weltsein, in the world being. And that, of course, is a Heideggerian point. And Heidegger didn't necessarily talk about this in terms of language or identity or knowledge quite like Foucault or Derrida did in kind of post-structuralist, post-modernist kind of stuff, or like Lyotard or something like this. But Heidegger points out that our ideas of being, of what it is to be, is necessarily caught up in a world, and this world is not something that can be done away with. he uses this in a very interesting kind of refutation of Descartes in the Meditations, in a sense. And he uses it throughout Being and Time, because Descartes says a number of things that Heidegger isn't so sure we can do. And it's a properly existentialist way of answering what is being, or an existentialist take on ontology, to put it another way. Descartes says, I am trying to build philosophy from principles that cannot possibly be doubted. And, the question could be, if I'm trying to build philosophy on things that can't be doubted, maybe it is the case there are things which are true which can be doubted, but nevertheless, I should stick within these kind of rationalistic ways of understanding and recognize that if I want to really talk about things productively, I have to do it within the confines of logic and within the confines of representation. So Descartes says, I'm just going to doubt that everything exists. I'm going to doubt that I am sitting in front of the fireplace in my dressing gown. I am going to doubt the existence of everything. He says, just like as if I were in a dream, and when I awake from that dream, I realize the stuff in the dream didn't exist. In that same way, I should levy that sort of doubt and use it to be critical of my experiences completely. In fact, critical of everything. And I need to find something that it would be contradictory to doubt. And of course, he finds that to be himself. And Heidegger says, you started by assuming that it was possible to doubt your world, that it was possible to decouple your ontology and really your epistemology from the world of experience. And Heidegger says, no, we cannot strip our understanding of being or of knowledge, of experience, in order to come to I think, therefore I am. Because the question that Heidegger is trying to get at is so fundamental and really difficult to cognitively get behind. But he says, look, we can say I think, therefore I am. And the idea of I think is the easy part of the equation. And of course, Hegel treated this whole thing like I am was the easy part. And the process of thinking was the confusing part. That, what does it really mean to think? What is the relationship between thinking and things that exist in and of themselves? And Heidegger says, well, we're supposing that we know what we mean by being. And on the first page of Being in Time, he quotes Plato, who is kind of talking about, in one of his dialogues, how we don't really understand what we mean by being. He says, Heidegger does, I think is kind of the easy part. Even though, exactly how consciousness interacts with the world is a very confusing endeavor that he tries to go through, I am is the confusing part. What does am mean? I call this an existential modifier, the term am. It is a word which represents being itself. It departs the idea of being onto the subject of the sentence. And the question is, how do we talk about being? And, this is a Heideggerian question. How do we talk about being without already presupposing ideas about what being is? And this is why he brings up the idea of in der Welt sein, in the world being. That our ideas of being are predicated upon a world of understanding, and a world which contextualizes our idea of being, that gives it some semblance of meaning. And it seems, if we try to give some sort of weight to the idea of being, and in the Cartesian I think therefore I am, we say, well, to say I am means that I exist, or that I am here. Well, then we could just ask, well, what do you mean by exist? What do you mean by here? How are you defining that term? And it might seem very silly, but it quickly becomes rather tautological, because we're like, well, I don't know, it's just being, it's just existence, it's pure there-ness. It's almost like the kind of thing you never really stop to think about, because it's so equiprimordial with our ideas of representation that it's unclear how we would even get behind it, or how we would even provide some justification for it. And that's Heidegger's point, is we are always pre-bound up in this world that Descartes tries to doubt. And Heidegger thinks that Descartes thinks he gets to something very amazing when he gets to the idea of I think, therefore I am. And Heidegger says, well, you've done all the easy work for us, but you really haven't said anything about existence. You've said existence exists, that there is existence, but you haven't really said anything of substance about what this actually means. To Heidegger, I think, therefore I am is kind of just words on a page, and we really haven't even gotten close to talking about what being actually means. And as such, he thinks that when Descartes tries to do this philosophy of doubt, he is running up against the fact that you cannot separate knowledge from ontology, from preontology, in the sense of a world that must be taken as already there in order for epistemology to make any sense. Because when we talk about epistemology, the philosophy or study of knowledge, we are presuming ideas about truth and falsity, and ideas about deduction versus induction, and ideas about how representation works. And these are bound up with ontological concepts, because if something is true, it exists, and if something is false, it does not exist. And Hegel kind of problematizes this by making us consider, and I guess it's really not Hegel, it's kind of just a fundamental constituent of the liar's paradox. If I say this statement is false, is that statement true? And in a more fundamental sense, which I guess this is really where Hegel comes in, is if something is false, we are saying it does not exist. But we're using the existential modifier is, which is, is and am are both existential modifiers. We are saying something is not true. So we're saying it has something definite, namely not truth. So it's like, even when we talk about something being false, for example, if I say I am not here, there is this thing, here-ness, being here, which I have. I have this quality of not being here. So our talks of being presuppose questions of identity in terms of we have to take for granted that a subject always exists, because in this situation, we have to presume preontologically that the subject of the sentence is really equiprimordial with our ideas of being, that to talk about something which is false requires us nevertheless levying being, which is something that exists, that is. So, all of that to say that our ideas of knowledge seem intimately tied up with our idea of what it is to exist. And this brings us to question, and this is something that Wittgenstein plays on a little bit, which is that the question can be raised if we can truly conceptualize of things that are false. Because if they're false, they are not. They do not exist. But we can really only conceptualize of falsity as a subset of a true proposition, namely that something is not true or something is false. That our ideas of epistemology take as a prerequisite this idea of being. And as a result, we have very specific issues that, in terms of the original idea of representation that I talked about, in terms of this might be like representation in academic journals of more feminist philosophers, that we need a widening of our perspective. And of course the idea behind doing this, and this is sort of something that is talked about, I can't remember her name, but in Quine as Feminist. It's an essay I read recently. I can't remember the name of the lady who wrote it. But, when we talk about like a feminist epistemology or an African epistemology or something like this, we don't mean that there's a separate epistemology for different communities, but rather that by contextualizing epistemological discussions and ideas of knowledge, we might reach some fuller idea of just what epistemology is, because we're very bound by very banal ideological apparatuses like schools or the police or government institutions that are going to make us believe things which might be very easy to see as being rather culturally relative. For example, the idea of homosexual marriage being an issue is very much donned as a weapon of culture and schools and, in a sense, scientific discourses. You think of, for example, AIDS being referred to as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome or disease. When it was kind of first on the scene, there's kind of this implicit idea within science, which is seen as very objective, of ideological mechanisms behind them. And as such, there are certainly certain ideas that we can see as trying to get behind by expanding our ideas of representation, and really implicit in this, what it means to exist, or what it means to be true, kind of expanding our epistemologies. But it's unclear if expanding, we can always expand our epistemologies more, and the question is, well, maybe not always, but there's certainly room to expand our epistemologies more. And the question is, in doing this, are we going to get any closer to getting behind die Seinsfrage, the question of being, of what it really means to exist, which is latent in our ideas of representation? So I think Heidegger probably at least of who I have read so far, has gotten the closest to getting behind these ideas of representation, because this takes on a very political bent in postcolonial studies, where it's very clear that that knowledge or objectivity is a constructed idea that has been used to subdue certain people. I think Foucault, in The Archaeology of Knowledge, takes this to the extreme, where he, I think rightly, says that knowledge is always predicated on some ideas of being which are probably ideologically constructed and which we can't necessarily get behind. And this mechanism, of course, is power, and power is always structuring our discourses, and it's unclear if we could ever get to a discussion of things without preontologically having to take for granted certain ideas of identity and representation. And this really has left me in a rut lately, and it bears up against my ideas of liberation movements. Because, for example, the Algerian or the Palestinian liberation movements come to mind, which I'm very much in favor of. I mean, I guess Algerian independence kind of already happened, but, just kind of historically speaking, we want these oppressions to be done away with. And we see what results from them as being very ideological, even things like the book. For example, Homi Bhabha talks about the idea of the book being constructed as an apparatus of control and an apparatus of creating a false epistemology that is going to get rid of certain perspectives. And of course, we can obviously see where getting rid of certain ideas of truth would interfere with us really being able to talk about the true. So, the post-colonial impetus makes sense in abstract, that we should vie to get out behind colonialism, because it's a very overt power structure which is going to shape our epistemologies. But the Foucauldian twist, of course, is we can't ever get out from under a power. So maybe Heidegger has a point. Maybe we should go for more of an existentialist bent towards this and say zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves. Instead of trying to get to the things themselves and never reaching them, we go for more of a phenomenological approach, and we recognize that there are always going to be these factors influencing the way that we are structuring our knowledge and our ideas of identity and representation, and as such, maybe we should kind of, in a pragmatic way, just kind of go the existentialist and phenomenological route. Maybe that's right. But I must confess that it gives me great dismay as a philosopher who very much started in the analytic tradition and in ideas of theology, for example. And something that brought me out of religion was the idea that if something cannot be objectively proven, we ought not believe in it. And that to be pragmatic and say, look, we just kind of have to do this if we want to be functional thinkers. Gavin 2 years ago would say, well, then fuck being a functional thinker. We ought to go for what's true, not what makes us feel good or able to function in our societies, because maybe that means something about our societies is messed up. And that was kind of the impetus behind, for example, stepping away from theism, because, even if it might be a useful apparatus for interpretation of events, that need not implicate that we should take that pragmatic turn. But now I'm at a bit of a crossroads where it's very clear, or not very clear, insofar as it's not very clear exactly what these structuring mechanisms are that structure our experience, but it is clear that there are structuring mechanisms of some kind. It's unclear how we would talk about being. For example, about a bush existing, or being in existence, are kind of synonyms for our purposes. It's unclear how we would talk about being without taking into account preontologically what being actually means, of what identity is. And as such, and Hegel tries to get behind this by talking about what structures our ideas of identity. And I think Hegel actually problematizes this in a way that opens up the flaws of his own system, because, he talks about being as being in flux, and it's always a process of becoming. But ultimately, Hegel wants to get to a philosophy of maximum surety and to universal truth. And he does this by subsuming ideas of difference to try to create maximum representation, to take into account dialectically every fact and everything that is the case, and even that which is not the case, and synthesize it into a system. But as a result, that really brings into question our ideas of identity, because I think Judith Butler, for example, in Gender Trouble, kind of hinging off Lacan, shows us that these ideas of identity or representation, in a sense, become contradictory or become a ruse when they're understood in abstract like this. Because, for example, Hegel is only understanding difference as sameness. And this is something that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get behind. But as a result, it is with great reticence that we approach this topic, and it's unclear that it's ever been answered in full, and that we can really get behind this dual practice of trying to get that maximum representation and getting behind things like colonial rule. But it is unclear that this is going to get us any closer to our idea of what being is, because being is always bound up within presumptions about being and about representation. So, as such, it is very clear that ontology is probably our more fundamental thing, because epistemology, we think of language as the most representational way of talking about epistemology, of we can put things into formulaic things of something exists or it doesn't, or say some statement about something. It is unclear how language can exist without presuming ideas of identity, and as such, we probably have to ontologically get underneath epistemology if we ever want to make any headway.